Growing up in the outskirts of Houston, tucked into one of those picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods where every lawn was aggressively trimmed and every driveway sparkled with late-model SUVs, I always knew I didn't belong, not in the community, not in my family, not even in my own skin some days. My name is Madison, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the invisible daughter. Not in some dramatic, theatrical way. No, my invisibility was quieter, more insidious. The kind of thing you don't even notice happening until you wake up one day and realize you could vanish into thin air and no one in your house would notice for hours, maybe even days. My older brother, Luke, had been crowned the family genius before he even hit double digits. He built his first computer at 11, started coding apps in middle school, and by 17 had already landed an internship with a tech firm in Austin that would later fast-track him into a six-figure job right out of college. Every dinner conversation, every family reunion, every Christmas newsletter was soaked in updates about Luke's latest milestones. Then there was Amanda, my sister, the golden child in pearls and power suits. From the time she could talk, she was arguing her way into or out of everything, and by high school, she had already mapped out her path to law school like she was designing a military campaign. She graduated summa cum laude, aced the bar on her first try, and now worked at a boutique firm in Dallas, handling high-profile divorce cases like she was born to do it. And then there was me. Madison. The so-called creative one. The one who organized birthday parties, styled baby showers, and decorated corporate holiday events with more passion than some people put into their entire careers. But to my parents, Diane and Carl, my job wasn't a real profession. It was a hobby. A phase. A punchline. I could plan an event for 500 people, manage catering disasters on the fly, and turn a dingy conference room into a fairy tale wedding venue in under 4 hours, and still, when people asked what I did, my mom would offer a tight smile and say something like, "Oh, Madison just does events. You know, fun little things." My dad, if he even responded, would just grunt and change the subject. I learned early on not to expect much, no words of affirmation, no proud smiles, no framed articles or glowing Facebook posts like the ones they shared about Luke's promotions or Amanda's courtroom wins. Just silence. Or worse, condescending nods as if to say, "Well, at least you're staying busy." What made it harder was how strategic their attention could be. They could ignore me for weeks, skip my calls, forget my birthday, but the moment they needed something, they remembered I existed. Like when Amanda's firm needed an emergency event set up with 24 hours notice, suddenly I was so talented and such a lifesaver. Or when Luke's startup hosted an investor mixer and their hired planner dropped out last minute, my dad called me personally to beg for help, though he never acknowledged it afterward. Not even a thank you text. And every time, like a fool, I said yes. I bent over backward to prove I was capable, that I mattered, that I wasn't some throwaway side character in my own family. But the truth was, no matter how well I executed, no matter how many compliments I got from their colleagues or friends, my parents' perception of me never changed. I was the afterthought. The backup. The one they called when everyone else bailed. Even holidays were a reminder of where I stood. Thanksgiving dinners would be organized around Amanda's schedule, and Christmas plans depended on when Luke could fly in. I was always expected to adjust, to fill in the gaps, to handle the decorations or plan the meals or do the shopping, but never once did they consider asking what worked for me. If I pushed back, I was being difficult. If I didn't show up, I was overreacting. It was a no-win situation, and eventually, I stopped trying to fight it. I just went through the motions, smiling through gritted teeth, making polite conversation, and leaving early under the excuse of an early client meeting or a venue walkthrough, though really I just couldn't stand to be there any longer than necessary. The worst part wasn't even the neglect, it was the gaslighting. The way my parents acted like I was imagining it all. If I ever brought up feeling overlooked or underappreciated, Diane would furrow her brow and say something like, "But we're so proud of you, sweetie," in that tone that made it clear she didn't mean it. Carl would shake his head and mutter, "You're too sensitive," before turning his attention back to the TV. They made me feel like I was crazy for wanting what they so freely gave to my siblings: basic respect, acknowledgement, affection. I started to keep my distance, physically and emotionally. I moved into a small duplex on the other side of the city and poured myself into my work, building a reputation in the event planning world that was actually something to be proud of, even if my own family refused to see it. My clients loved me. My team respected me. Venues and vendors referred me without hesitation. But every time I saw a new milestone in Luke's life celebrated like a national holiday, or watched Amanda's name pop up in another feature article, that old ache came creeping back. The one that whispered, "You'll never be enough for them." I didn't want their praise anymore, not really. I just wanted them to see me. To treat me like more than a utility. To love me without condition. But that kind of love doesn't grow in barren soil. And my parents' love, if it ever existed at all, had dried up long ago. By the time I turned 25, everything in my life was finally aligning in a way that felt real, grounded, and wholly mine. I had just been promoted to senior event manager at one of the most prestigious event planning firms in Texas, the kind of firm that handled luxury galas, celebrity weddings, and multi-million-dollar corporate launches. After years of cutting my teeth on smaller, chaotic events where I had to haul crates and iron linens myself, I was finally leading a team, delegating tasks, and being trusted with clients whose budgets alone were larger than my parents' entire mortgage. My name was on contracts, my calendar was booked out months in advance, and my salary had just crossed into six figures, something I hadn't even dared to dream of when I first started. I was no longer just doing fun little things. I was building experiences people would remember for the rest of their lives, and I was damn good at it. And then there was Tyler. Tyler, with his quiet intelligence and endless patience, who taught high school history at a public school in the city and somehow still found energy to make me laugh after 10 hours on his feet. He was the kind of man who noticed when I was about to cry before I even realized it myself, who packed my favorite snacks in my bag on days he knew I'd be too busy to eat, who made my apartment feel like a home just by being in it. He didn't care that I wasn't a lawyer or an engineer or someone with a title that made people nod with impressed confusion. He saw what I did for what it was, art, leadership, strategy, and he never once made me feel like I had to explain or justify it. When he proposed, it wasn't some grand gesture designed for social media. It was in our kitchen, barefoot and quiet, with flour on his cheek from the pizza dough we'd been rolling out together. He got down on one knee, not because of some expectation, but because he said I deserved to be asked in the most sincere way possible. I said yes, without hesitation. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had finally built a life that wasn't defined by what my family thought of me. Still, in the back of my mind, there was a small flicker of hope, a foolish, persistent ember that maybe now, with this promotion, this ring, this fully realized life I had carved out with grit and exhaustion and stubbornness, my family would see me differently. Maybe this would be the moment they finally looked at me and said, "We're proud of you." I made the announcement the same week I signed the promotion paperwork. I took time to write out individual messages to my family, personal and specific, because I didn't want them to hear about it through someone else. I texted my mom first, telling her the news about the promotion, the raise, and Tyler's proposal, attaching a photo of the ring and a quick snapshot of the view from my new office. It took her over 6 hours to reply. When she finally did, her message was a dry, "That's nice, sweetie. When's the wedding?" No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the job, the promotion, the years of work that had led to this moment. Just the wedding. Because that, in her eyes, was something she could understand. Something she could show off. My dad didn't respond at all. When I called him that evening to follow up, he answered with his usual brusque tone, clearly distracted, and said, "That's great, Mads. You know, Amanda's firm just landed a new partnership with a state senator. Isn't that something?" And just like that, I disappeared again, buried beneath Amanda's latest triumph. Luke at least managed a "proud of you, sis," but it felt obligatory, like he was checking a box before logging off our family group chat for another month. I tried not to let it crush me. I tried to remind myself of all the ways my life was full and whole without their validation. But it stung in a way I couldn't quite describe. Not because I needed their approval to feel successful, but because it would have meant something if, just once, they saw me the way Tyler did. As someone who had worked for everything I had, who had carved out a place in the world on my own terms, who deserved more than a lukewarm shrug. Instead, they asked if Tyler made enough to support a family, if we were sure we wanted to get married so young, if I planned on slowing down my work schedule once kids came along. They didn't ask about the venues I was managing, the clients I was meeting, or the cities I was flying to. They didn't ask about the happiness I felt waking up next to a man who truly loved me. They didn't even ask how I was holding up, balancing it all. They simply pivoted to topics they considered more serious, more important: Amanda's upcoming trial, Luke's new investment opportunity, their own upcoming trip to Colorado with friends I hadn't been invited to see in years. In the weeks that followed, I stopped bringing them news. I stopped trying to get a reaction. I buried myself in work, celebrated with Tyler, shared my joy with friends who knew what it meant, who popped champagne and toasted to my success without qualification. But at night, sometimes, I'd lie awake and stare at the ceiling, wondering why it still hurt so much. Why a part of me still longed for something that clearly wasn't coming. Why I kept expecting my family to be something they never were, and maybe never would be. In the weeks leading up to our annual family dinner, I poured myself into a project that I truly believed would bridge the distance that had always existed between me and the rest of them. I knew the dinner was going to be the moment I shared my engagement and promotion in person, and despite everything, despite the years of being overlooked and dismissed, I still held on to a fragile hope that if I approached it the right way, if I reminded them of who I was and what I meant to this family, maybe this time they'd look at me differently. So I started working on something I thought would matter, something that came from the deepest part of myself. I spent weeks building a photo album, not some cheap online book but a hand-bound, page-by-page collection that covered decades of our family's life together. I went through thousands of digital files and old boxes, scanned photos from our childhood, captioned them with dates, places, and little inside jokes I thought they'd remember. I added handwritten notes next to pictures of birthday parties I'd helped plan, holidays we'd all spent cramped together in the kitchen, and vacations where I'd been the one taking the pictures everyone else forgot to look at. I made sure everyone was represented, balanced, and fair. There were pages dedicated to Luke's science fair victories, Amanda's high school debate wins, and even early shots of me setting up the decorations at Grandma's 70th birthday, the party no one had acknowledged I'd organized from start to finish. The process was emotional, exhausting, and strangely therapeutic. I cried more than once, sitting on the floor with piles of old photographs, remembering the look on my dad's face when I tried to help him hang the Christmas lights, or the time my mom forgot to pick me up from a school field trip and I sat on the curb until sunset. But I didn't put those memories in the album. I kept it light. Joyful. Nostalgic. I wanted it to be something that reminded them of the good, something that softened their edges before I opened up about my own good news. I tied the finished book in a satin ribbon and slid it into a canvas sleeve I decorated with pressed flowers and gold ink. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it was full of love and time and intent, something I knew none of them would ever take the time to do themselves. When the evening came, I arrived early, like I always did, helping set the table and finish the prep in the kitchen while Amanda lounged on the couch with a glass of wine and Luke fiddled with the Bluetooth speaker. My mom barely acknowledged my entrance with more than a distracted "Hi, hon," and my dad didn't look up from his phone. I waited until after we'd all eaten, once the dishes had been cleared and people were settling into their usual post-dinner routines, before I pulled the album from my bag. My heart was pounding, but I smiled and walked over to where my mom was sitting on the love seat, handed her the package, and said, "I made something for everyone. I thought it would be nice to look through together." She took it from my hands without looking up and muttered, "Just leave it somewhere, I'll check it out later," like I was handing her a grocery flyer or a piece of unsolicited mail. My arms hung there for a second too long after she took it, as if I wasn't sure what to do with the weight that had just shifted out of my hands. I waited, still smiling, hoping maybe she'd change her mind, maybe she'd untie the ribbon and flip to the first page and see the opening photo of the four of us as kids on the front porch, barefoot and grinning, with our dog Bailey curled up at our feet. But she didn't. She just dropped it onto the side table next to her glass of Chardonnay and returned to her conversation with Amanda, who was talking about some ridiculous client story from work. I looked at Luke, who was sitting across the room scrolling on his phone, and said, "Hey, I put a bunch of old photos of you in there, from your science fair, remember the volcano one?" He didn't even glance up. "Cool," he said, his thumbs not even slowing down. No one asked to see it. No one opened it. No one said thank you. I sat down at the far end of the room, the silence roaring in my ears, my palms still tingling from how tightly I'd held the album on the drive over. My chest felt hollow, like something inside me had cracked open too wide and now there was nothing left to fill the space. I kept waiting for someone, anyone, to change the subject to me, to ask what I'd been up to give me an opening to share my engagement or my promotion. But the conversation stayed firmly in their world, orbiting around Amanda's trial prep, Luke's next software release, my mom's upcoming trip to Santa Fe with her book club friends. I'd spent weeks crafting a tribute to our family, a physical manifestation of memories and effort and longing, and it was treated like clutter. Like background noise. When it was time to leave, I considered grabbing the album and taking it back home with me, but I couldn't bring myself to walk back across that room, to draw attention to something that clearly didn't matter to them. So I left it there, tucked under a stack of magazines, ribbons still tied. And as I walked out to my car, the cold air hitting my face sharper than I expected, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding for years: you can't make people care just because you do. And no amount of perfect pages or carefully preserved memories would ever be enough to make me visible to people who had never truly seen me. Dinner dragged on longer than usual, the kind of suffocating evening where every minute feels heavy and stretched thin, and by the time dessert was brought out, my nerves were so tightly wound that my hands were trembling in my lap. I had already missed several chances to speak, every pause immediately filled by Amanda's voice or Luke's commentary, but I told myself I couldn't leave without saying something, not after everything I had poured into this night, not after carrying the weight of my own life-changing news around like a secret that was rotting inside me. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure everyone could hear it when I finally cleared my throat, leaned forward slightly, and opened my mouth, determined to be calm, to be composed, to sound like someone who deserved to be heard. I got promoted, I said, my voice steady at first, even though my chest felt like it was caving in, and I saw my mom glance at me briefly before looking away again, already disinterested. And Tyler and I didn't even get to finish the sentence. The sharp clang of metal against ceramic cut straight through my words as my father slammed his fork down on the plate with enough force to make everyone jump. The sound echoed in the room, loud and final, like a door being slammed shut in my face. "Oh please," Carl snapped, his voice dripping with irritation as he leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me for the first time that evening, his expression hard and dismissive. "You're the most useless child in this house." The words hit me so suddenly and so brutally that for a split second, my brain refused to process them, like my mind was scrambling to protect me from the full impact. Then Amanda laughed. Not an awkward, uncomfortable laugh, not the kind that comes from shock or disbelief, but a genuine, amused laugh, like he'd just delivered a clever punchline. Diane smirked into her wine glass, the corners of her mouth curling upward as if she agreed but didn't feel the need to say it out loud. Luke grinned, shaking his head slightly, like this was all just harmless family banter and not a public execution of my dignity. No one told him to stop. No one said he'd gone too far. No one looked at me with concern or even surprise. They just let it hang there in the air, that sentence, that label, settling over me like a verdict that had already been decided years ago. I felt my face burn, my throat tighten, my vision blur at the edges, but still I sat there, frozen, humiliated beyond words, my unfinished sentence dissolving into nothing. I realized in that moment that it didn't matter what I had accomplished or who I had become. To them, I would always be the family disappointment, the one they could belittle without consequence, the one whose achievements didn't count because they didn't fit the narrative they'd already written for me. Something inside me finally broke, not loudly, not explosively, but in a slow, devastating way that felt irreversible. Years of being talked over, minimized, used, and discarded came crashing down all at once, every insult I'd brushed off, every slight I'd swallowed, every time I'd convinced myself they didn't mean it or that I was just being sensitive. I looked around the table at their faces, at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity wash over me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad night or a poorly timed joke. This was who they were, and this was how little I mattered to them. My hands were shaking now, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't defend myself, because suddenly I understood that nothing I said would change anything. They had already made up their minds about me long ago, and no promotion, no engagement, no carefully handmade album was ever going to earn me the respect they gave so freely to everyone else. I pushed my chair back slowly, the leg scraping against the floor, and stood up, my heart pounding in my ears. They all looked at me then, mildly annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been, and as I walked out of that house for what felt like the 1,000th time, I knew something had fundamentally changed. Not them. Me. Because for the first time I wasn't drowning in their noise anymore. I was done trying to be heard by people who had spent a lifetime proving they never wanted to listen. For a brief moment after my father's words landed and everyone else's reactions followed, the room fell into an awkward, expectant silence, as if they were all waiting for me to finally snap, to cry, to shout, to give them the emotional outburst they could later mock or dismiss. Instead, something eerily calm settled over me, so sudden and so complete that it almost scared me. I felt my lips curve upward into a slow, measured smile, the kind that wasn't born from happiness but from resignation, the kind that makes people uneasy because they can sense they've pushed too far but don't yet understand the consequences. I could see it on their faces as they watched me, confusion flickering behind their expressions when I didn't react the way they expected. I stood up smoothly, pushing my chair back without force, without anger, without theatrics, and the sound it made against the floor seemed louder than any yelling ever could have been. No one spoke at first. They just stared at me like I was breaking some unspoken rule, like I was supposed to stay seated and absorb the insult, smile politely, and keep playing my role. My hands were steady as I reached for my purse, slung it over my shoulder, and took a slow look around the room that had witnessed so many small humiliations over the years. The dining table where my achievements had been ignored, the walls decorated with framed photos that told a carefully curated story of a family I had never truly been a part of, the familiar space that had never once felt safe or warm to me. As I turned toward the front door, my mother finally found her voice, her tone sharp with irritation rather than concern as she asked, "Where do you think you're going?" It wasn't a question rooted in worry or care. It was about control, about the audacity of me leaving before they'd decided the evening was over. My father echoed her, scoffing as if I were being dramatic, while Amanda rolled her eyes and Luke let out a quiet laugh, clearly convinced I'd be back in my seat in a matter of seconds, embarrassed and compliant like I always had been before. I didn't answer them. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because they didn't deserve an explanation. I had spent my entire life explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds, justifying my existence, my choices, my worth, and I was done handing them pieces of myself they would only tear apart. I walked to the door, my steps unhurried, my heart pounding but my resolve firm, and reached for the handle. For a split second, I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awareness of the finality of what I was doing. This wasn't just me leaving a dinner early. This was me stepping away from a lifetime of trying and failing to earn something that was never going to be given freely. The door opened easily, the cool night air rushing in and wrapping around me like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. I stepped outside, pulled the door closed behind me, and the soft but definitive click of the lock echoed in the quiet street. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it felt absolute. Like the final nail in the coffin of their approval, the end of a chapter one had kept rereading in the hope that the ending would change. As I walked toward my car under the dim glow of the streetlights, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, walking away didn't feel like losing something. It felt like finally letting go of a weight I was never meant to carry. I sat in my car with the engine off, the dashboard dark, the house looming behind me like a place I no longer belonged, and for a long moment I just stared at my phone resting in my hand, feeling the aftershocks of everything that had just happened ripple through my body. My heart was still racing, but beneath the adrenaline there was a strange, unfamiliar sense of certainty, the kind that only comes when a decision has already been made long before you consciously acknowledge it. My fingers hovered over the family group chat, the same one that had existed for years almost exclusively for requests, reminders, and expectations, never for gratitude or concern, and I realized how fitting it was that this would be where I finally said what I'd been holding back for so long. I typed the message slowly, deliberately, each word heavy with finality, and when I hit send, it felt like cutting a cord that had been wrapped around my chest for years. No more money. Good luck. That was it. No explanations, no justifications, no emotional pleas. Just the truth, stripped down to its core. For years, I had been their quiet safety net, the invisible solution to problems they never thought twice about dropping into my lap. While they mocked my career and dismissed my worth, they had no issue accepting my help, my bank transfers, my sacrifices, as if it were something they were entitled to rather than something I was choosing to give. I had covered part of their mortgage every single month when my parents were struggling, sending $1,500 without fail, sometimes before paying my own rent, sometimes while telling myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, they'd stand on their own. I paid $3,000 outright for my mother's surgery when insurance fell short, transferring the money within hours of her call, no questions asked, no hesitation, only to be met with a curt acknowledgement and silence afterward. I wrote a $5,000 check toward Amanda's law school tuition when she came up short one semester, framing it as a loan she never repaid and never mentioned again, except to complain about how expensive her education had been. Luke had borrowed money too, for investments and opportunities, sums he promised would come back to me tenfold once his projects took off, promises that dissolved into nothing the moment the money left my account. Not once had any of them said thank you in a way that felt sincere. Not once had they acknowledged the weight of what I was giving up to keep them afloat. They didn't ask if I could afford it. They didn't ask if it put me under stress. They just assumed I would handle it, because I always had. I had been good, dependable, useful in the one way they found acceptable, and I let myself believe that if I kept showing up, kept sacrificing, it would eventually earn me a place at the table that wasn't conditional. Instead, it only taught them that my boundaries were flexible and my worth was negotiable. As the message sat there in the chat, unread at first, I felt a rush of memories crash over me. Every transfer confirmation, every late-night calculation of my budget, every moment I told myself that love sometimes looked like inconvenience and discomfort. But sitting there alone in my car, the silence broken only by the faint hum of traffic in the distance, I finally saw it clearly. This wasn't love. This was obligation dressed up as family. And I was done funding people who couldn't even offer me basic respect. The read receipts began to appear one by one, little indicators lighting up my screen, and with each one, I felt lighter instead of afraid. I didn't wait for the replies. I didn't need to see the shock, the anger, the sudden panic that I knew was coming. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the car, and pulled away from the curb. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for the fallout. I was choosing myself, and that decision felt more powerful than any approval they had ever withheld. By the time morning light crept through my curtains, pale and unforgiving, my phone felt heavier than it ever had before, buzzing nonstop on the nightstand like it was trying to crawl away from me. I hadn't slept much, not because I regretted what I'd done, but because my mind was finally processing the magnitude of it, replaying years of quiet compliance and realizing just how deep the damage went. When I finally reached for my phone, the screen lit up with a number that made my stomach tighten despite myself. More than 50 missed calls, a flood of voicemails, texts stacked on top of each other so tightly they blurred into one overwhelming block of desperation. Most of them were from my mom. Her messages swung wildly between panic and guilt, voice notes thick with tears as she begged me to call her back, to explain, to tell her this was some kind of misunderstanding. She talked about family, about how they needed me, about how I was overreacting and we could talk it out if I would just come over and be reasonable. My dad called too, fewer times, but the voicemail he left sat heavy in my chest. It was short, stripped of his usual sharpness, and all he said was, "Please." No apology. No acknowledgement of what he'd said the night before. Just a plea, as if the problem wasn't the years of cruelty, but the sudden inconvenience of losing their financial lifeline. Amanda sent texts that were icy and accusatory, telling me I was being dramatic and selfish, reminding me of everything the family had done for me growing up, conveniently forgetting the balance of what I had given back. Luke tried a different approach, sending a casual message like nothing had happened, asking if we could talk this out like adults, as if adulthood hadn't been exactly what I'd been forced into far too early. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding to anyone, my thumb hovering as the weight of old anger and new clarity pressed down on me. Eventually, I replied once, to my father, because his single word echoed louder than all the others combined. I typed 2 words and sent them before I could second-guess myself, useless as busy. It was petty, yes, but it was also honest, a mirror held up to the label he'd thrown at me so casually, now turned back on him when he needed something from me. Then I opened the family group chat, the same digital space where I had been summoned for help and ignored the rest of the time, and I decided that if I was going to be done, I was going to be done completely. I wrote everything out, slowly and carefully, not in anger but in clarity, listing every dollar I had given and every sacrifice I had made. I reminded them of the $1,500 a month I'd paid toward their mortgage when they were falling behind, the $3,000 I sent without hesitation for my mom's surgery, the $5,000 I contributed to Amanda's law school tuition when she came up short, the countless smaller amounts I'd transferred to Luke for his projects that never paid me back. I wrote about the overtime I'd taken, the vacations I'd skipped, the nights I'd sat alone balancing my budget so they wouldn't have to worry. I wrote about how not once had I been thanked, not once had my help been acknowledged as anything other than expected. I didn't insult them. I didn't threaten them. I didn't ask for repayment. I simply laid out the truth in black and white and ended it with a single sentence that felt like a door closing, "This ends now." When I hit send, my hands were shaking, but my mind was calm, clearer than it had ever been. The message went through, the read receipts popped up one by one, and then everything stopped. No replies. No calls. No excuses. Just silence. And for the first time in my life, that silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. Later that afternoon, when the house was finally quiet and my phone had stopped vibrating with the desperate frequency of the morning, it rang again, but this time it wasn't another name I'd grown to associate with entitlement or emotional blackmail lighting up the screen. It was my grandfather. Richard. My mom's father. The only person in that entire family who had ever spoken to me like I was a real person, who had taken the time over the years to ask how I was doing without slipping in a request for something. I stared at his name for a moment, not sure if I had the energy to answer, not sure what he'd say or how much he'd heard, but something in my chest pulled me to swipe right and bring the phone to my ear. "Good for you, kid," was the first thing he said, his voice steady, gravelly with age but firm in a way that made my throat tighten instantly. Not what happened. Not why did you do it. Just those 4 words. Good for you. The validation hit me harder than I expected, because it wasn't coddling or performative or wrapped in conditions, it was sincere. It was simple. It was everything I had never gotten from the people who were supposed to see me first. I didn't even realize I'd started crying until he paused and said softly, "You did the right thing." I sat there on the edge of my bed, one hand pressed against my mouth to keep the sobs in check, listening as he told me how proud he was that I had finally stood up for myself, that it had gone on far too long, and that he had watched, helpless, as they took and never gave anything back. He said he had always known they were using me, always felt sick watching them pat themselves on the back while I quietly held everything together, but he had hoped, maybe foolishly, that one day they would wake up and realize what they were doing. "But last night," he said, his tone darkening. "Calling you useless after everything you've done? After you paid their bills and kept their lives together like some kind of servant? That's when I knew it wasn't ignorance anymore. It was cruelty." He told me that after our call, he had immediately phoned Diane and Carl, something he rarely did unless it was important, and he didn't waste time. He said he didn't ask questions or let them talk their way around it. He just let them have it. I could hear the edge of fury still lingering in his voice as he repeated the words he'd told them. "You leeched off your daughter and called her useless? Shame on you." He said he didn't care what their excuses were, didn't care how they tried to frame it, he made it clear that what they'd done was disgusting, and that he was ashamed of them. I imagined my mother's face hearing that from her own father, the way her carefully controlled image would crack under the weight of actual accountability, and for once, I didn't feel guilty. I felt vindicated. He didn't try to sugarcoat anything. He didn't say they'd change or that they'd come around or that I should give them another chance. He just told me that I didn't deserve to be treated like that I never had, and that he hoped I never let them or anyone else talk to me that way again. And when I thanked him, my voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "You don't need to thank me for saying what's right. You just need to remember who you are." Because they sure as hell never did. After that call, I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, staring at the blank screen, the silence that had once felt suffocating now feeling strangely light. I realized in that moment that my grandfather's words had done something that nothing else had managed to do, not the insults, not the years of neglect, not even my own silence breaking. It closed the book. Not just on the argument, not just on the money, but on the decades of craving their approval. His voice cut through all the noise and left me with something I'd never had from my own parents, the unshakable truth that I was never the problem. And that was the last time I ever cared what Diane or Carl thought about me. In the days and weeks that followed my final message, the silence I had once feared became a steady hum of freedom, and I watched from a distance as everything they had built, or rather, everything they had balanced on my back, began to collapse under its own weight. At first, it was subtle. A missed payment here, a delayed response there, little tremors that didn't seem like much on their own, but I knew the foundation well enough to recognize the early signs of a system starting to buckle. Without the monthly $1,500 I had been quietly depositing into their joint account for the mortgage, the cushion they had taken for granted was gone, and it didn't take long for the pressure to show. The house, that oversized, beige 2-story monument to appearances, was the first to go. They had refinanced it twice to keep up with repairs, vacations, and unnecessary upgrades, confident that whatever shortfall they encountered, I'd cover it like I always had. But this time, when the bank came calling, there was no safety net, no emergency wire transfer, no late-night call to me that ended with me saving them again. Within 6 weeks, the foreclosure notice was public record. I didn't need to ask. I saw the listing appear online, the words pre-foreclosure stamped across the same address I had helped them hang Christmas lights on more times than I could count. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I closed the tab and didn't look back. Amanda's unraveling came next. She had always portrayed herself as bulletproof, the perfectly tailored lawyer with the sharp tongue and designer heels, but her life had always been more smoke and mirrors than substance. I knew for years that my money had kept her afloat during law school, that she had borrowed more than she liked to admit and never quite made peace with living within her means. The real estate investment she'd bragged about, some luxury condo she claimed would double in value, turned out to be a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. Without my help to close the gap in her financing, the deal collapsed. The bank backed out. The client sued for breach of contract. Her firm's name was dragged into the mess, and suddenly the rising star was a liability. Her spotless image cracked wide open, and I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she was taking a leave of absence that everyone knew wasn't voluntary. Luke, who had once been the family's favorite example of effortless genius, hadn't been living effortlessly in years. He'd burned through 2 startups, lost investor confidence, and had been relying on short-term freelance contracts and loans, many of them from me, to keep his head above water. Without the small infusions of cash I had sent every time he claimed a check was delayed or a client hadn't paid, his carefully curated life began to erode. The last I heard, he was working overnight shifts at a data center, doing basic server maintenance and tech support, jobs he would have once mocked as beneath him. There was no trace left of the confident entrepreneur my parents had bragged about over holiday dinners. Just a man scrambling to hold on to what little he had left, stripped of the invisible scaffolding I had been providing for years. Watching it unfold was surreal. Not because I wanted them to suffer, despite everything, I never took joy in their pain, but because for the first time I was seeing the reality behind the illusion I had been forced to maintain. Their golden lives had never been golden at all. They had been polished just enough to reflect light back at themselves, just enough to fool others, but they were always fragile. Always dependent on someone doing the unglamorous, unthanked work of holding everything together. That someone had been me. And without me, without the constant stream of money and energy and patience they had consumed like it was endless, the cracks turned to fractures, and the fractures turned into collapse. No one reached out again after that. Not Diane. Not Carl. Not Amanda or Luke. Whether it was pride or shame or denial, they vanished from my phone like ghosts who finally understood they weren't welcome. I didn't chase them. I didn't block them either. I just let the silence expand, let it become the new normal, the way it always should have been, me, free from the weight of their needs, free to exist without being drained, without being punished for not fitting the mold they had tried to force me into. And as their carefully constructed lives fell apart piece by piece, I didn't feel guilty. I felt clean. A few days after the silence had fully set in, after the missed calls slowed to nothing and the dust of their unraveling began to settle, my grandfather called me again, not to pull me back in, but to let me know what was coming. He told me he had decided to organize a family call, one last attempt to bring them face to face with what they had done, not because he expected them to fix it, but because he wanted them to hear the truth out loud, without the comfort of denial. He didn't ask me to join. He knew better. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilt for not showing up. I didn't owe them my presence anymore. I had nothing left to explain. The call was set for Sunday evening, the same time our family used to pretend we were close over group chats and birthday messages none of them ever meant. Instead of preparing for it, I went about my day like any other. I slept in. I took my time getting dressed. I brewed my favorite coffee and poured it into the ceramic mug Tyler had given me last Christmas, the one that said "Let them talk" in black cursive across the front. I sat outside on my balcony with the mug warming my hands, the air crisp and quiet around me, while inside some screen miles away, my family was imploding. Grandpa told me later how it went, how he didn't let them open the conversation with excuses or finger-pointing. He started by telling them plainly, without ceremony, that they had lost me. That I was gone, not physically, not geographically, but emotionally, spiritually, irrevocably. And that they had no one to blame for it but themselves. He laid out every moment they had dismissed me, every instance of manipulation, every dollar they took without gratitude, every word they'd thrown that wounded me deeper than they cared to realize. He told them they had chewed up the best parts of me and spit them out like scraps and still expected me to sit at their table smiling. He said I had saved them, time and time again, and all they ever gave me in return was silence, mockery, or worse, indifference. He told me Amanda tried to interrupt him, claimed I had twisted everything, but he shut her down before she could finish her sentence. Luke, apparently, tried to play the middle ground, said I should have talked to them, but Grandpa wasn't having it. She did, he told them. You just never listened. Carl sat in silence, which wasn't surprising, and Diane, predictably, turned defensive. She said I was punishing them for loving me wrong. He told her she didn't know the first thing about love if she thought what they gave me counted. Then it all exploded. Voices raised, blame thrown in every direction except the mirror. My name, Grandpa said, came up over and over again, each time like a grenade, each time sending the conversation further off the rails. They accused each other of enabling me, of depending on me, of turning the family into a hierarchy where I was somehow both at the bottom and the one holding it all up. It was chaos. It was everything I had endured for years but finally didn't have to absorb. I wasn't there. I didn't hear the shouting or the crying or the accusations. I didn't have to defend myself or be the mediator or the fixer or the quiet punching bag. I was miles away, wrapped in peace, the sun warming my legs through the railing, my coffee still hot, my mind still quiet. And in that moment, while they screamed my name like it was a weapon, I was free. Not just because I had left, but because I didn't feel the urge to go back. Not even to listen. Not even to win. The fight was over. The damage had been done long before that call, and the healing had already begun the moment I stopped waiting for them to understand what they never would. I didn't need them to fall apart to prove that I mattered. I just needed to step away, and let the truth, finally, speak louder than I ever could. Months passed like pages turning in a book I had finally started writing for myself, and with each new day, the weight of my past loosened its grip just a little more. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner, untouched by the toxic patterns I had spent most of my life wrapped in. Tyler and I found a house on the edge of the city, quiet and warm with wide windows and a creaking front porch that reminded me of the parts of childhood I had longed for but never had. We moved in just as the first signs of spring began to bloom, our boxes full of mismatched furniture and future plans. It wasn't grand or magazine perfect, but it was ours. Fully, truly ours. Paid for by our own hands, our own choices, our own work. There was no ghost of obligation lingering in the walls, no invisible debt hanging in the air. Just freedom, fresh paint, and a sense of becoming. Professionally, everything I had fought for was finally being recognized on my own terms. I had been promoted again, this time to director of events, overseeing multiple teams, managing clients I once dreamed of landing, shaping the creative vision of projects I used to only assist on. I walked into rooms where my voice held weight, where my decisions shaped outcomes, where I wasn't the afterthought or the helper, I was the authority. People respected me. They listened when I spoke. They sought out my opinion because they knew I brought more than aesthetics to the table. I brought experience, clarity, and a calm kind of command that had been forged in silence and built in shadows. Now I stood in the light, not asking to be seen, but knowing I belonged there. My phone was quieter now. Blissfully so. I had blocked my family, Diane, Carl, Amanda, Luke. All of them. No last chances. No drawn-out explanations. No performative forgiveness. Just the hard, clean line of boundaries finally enforced. The only voice that still made its way through was Grandpa's, and it came in the form of letters, written in his crooked, deliberate handwriting on heavy paper that smelled faintly of ink and age. He sent them every few weeks, always unassuming, folded neatly in simple envelopes with my name carefully printed on the front like it mattered. And it did. More than he probably knew. Each letter was a bomb. He didn't dwell on the past, didn't rehash the mess or try to play mediator. He wrote about his garden, the birds he saw on his walks, memories from his time in the Navy. But always, tucked somewhere in the middle or at the end, there was a line just for me. A line that reminded me he still saw me, clearly and without distortion. You've always had the strength, he wrote in one of the last ones I received, underlining the words once, not for emphasis, but for certainty. Not as encouragement. As fact. And for the first time in my life, I didn't question it. I didn't read the words with suspicion or try to discount them. I let them settle into me like truth. Because I had survived a family that had demanded everything and returned nothing. I had built a career that mattered, that made people's lives better, even if it didn't look like success to those who refused to understand it. I had given more than anyone should ever be asked to give, and when I finally stopped, the world didn't collapse around me, I just stepped into a better one. In the quiet mornings of our new home, sunlight spilling through the windows and coffee brewing in the kitchen, I sometimes caught myself smiling for no reason at all. Not because life was perfect. Not because all the wounds had healed. But because for once, the life around me wasn't something I was enduring. It was something I had chosen. Something I had built. And I was finally strong enough to live it fully, without apology, without asking for permission, and without looking back. Our wedding was everything I had once convinced myself I didn't deserve: simple, intimate, real. There was no extravagant guest list, no over-the-top displays meant to impress people who didn't matter. It wasn't curated for anyone but us. We held it in the backyard of a historic inn tucked just outside the city, where string lights hung between oak trees and the scent of lavender drifted through the warm night air. Every detail had meaning. The table settings were hand-picked, the flowers were from a local farm I'd worked with for years, and the music was chosen not for trend, but for memory. It wasn't about the show. It was about us. Tyler looked at me the way he always had, not like someone admiring a perfect image, but like someone seeing the full picture and loving it anyway. When I walked down the aisle, there was no one giving me away because I wasn't being given. I wasn't anyone's to transfer. I walked myself, head held high, every step a quiet rebellion against the years I'd spent seeking permission to belong. And in the front row, sitting tall in his pressed suit, was Grandpa Richard, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes but never falling. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said everything. He had watched me fight for my place, and now he was watching me claim it, fully, freely, without compromise. Carl wasn't there. Diane wasn't there. Amanda and Luke weren't there. There were no awkward glances, no forced smiles, no tightly controlled conversations that left me aching by the end of the night. Their absence wasn't a wound, it was a gift. There were no apologies, no reconciliations, no seats held open in the naive hope they'd change their minds. Their names were never mentioned, their shadows never allowed in. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel loss. I felt peace. Complete, undisturbed peace. After the vows, we danced barefoot under the stars, the grass cool beneath our feet, the night air humming with laughter and the low rhythm of music drifting from the speakers. My dress brushed against the earth, my hands wrapped in Tyler's, and when I looked up into the sky, so open, so endless, I felt a stillness I had never known before. Not silence. Not absence. Just space. Space I had made for myself by finally letting go of everything that had kept me small. There was no speech about what I had overcome. No theatrical breakdown. Just joy. Real, rooted joy that came from knowing I had done the hardest thing I would ever do, not walk away, not cut ties, not stand up for myself, though all of those were part of it. The hardest thing was choosing myself, again and again, even when it hurt, even when it meant being alone, even when it meant rebuilding from nothing. I had once believed that my value came from how well I could hold everyone else up. Now I knew better. Their lives had unraveled without me, not out of malice or punishment, but because they had never learned how to stand without my quiet, relentless support. Every piece they had balanced on me fell when I stepped away. And as those pieces scattered, I didn't reach to catch them. I let them fall. Because I had finally understood that I wasn't responsible for their chaos, only for my own peace. And on that night, under those lights, with the people who loved me exactly as I was, I felt the fullness of that peace settle into my bones. I had chosen myself. And everything beautiful in my life had grown from that choice.